Dr. Shoemaker, Dr. McMahon, welcome to the program. I'm very interested in talking to you guys today. My daughter has alerted me to your work, and I've been looking into it for the last 4 or 5 months. You guys have been studying something called chronic inflammatory response syndrome, and the more I've looked into this, the deeper the rabbit hole goes, I suppose you could say that. And I thought the best way to educate myself and potentially everyone else who's listening and watching would be to have you guys on this podcast so I could ask you all sorts of questions. And so I'm going to take a friendly, skeptical approach, if you don't mind, because what you're studying is of such magnitude that if you're correct, it's a catastrophe. And so we could all hope that you're not correct so that it isn't a catastrophe. But I know you've accumulated a substantial amount of evidence. And so maybe we'll start with you, Dr. Shoemaker. Do you want to just tell everybody what it is you've been studying and why you started studying it and how widespread you think the problem is?
Most people have a sense of what inflammation is. Our body is looking at environmental stressors that must be dealt with, and the inflammatory process, as a general rule, is part of the environmental response to trauma or stress. Inflammation can be of two kinds. One is acquired or allergy, or kind of the adaptive way that the body will learn how to make antibodies and respond to stressors with memory. So there's things will be experienced once, and then the next time is very quick. But we're looking at a different form, the left hand, if you will, compared to the right hand, of innate immune responses, in which the response to an antigen or a foreign particle that's introduced into the body in many different ways. Inhalation is certainly the big way I worry about, but it could be elsewhere. But specifically, once there is antigen detection by the innate immune response system, there should be processing of an antigen and putting on a HLA molecule or histocompatibility locus A molecule on the antigen and packaging it in antigen presenting cells to a naive lymphocyte, just waiting for something to happen. And when the naive lymphocyte sees this tasty little morsel packaged with HLA and an antigen on it, it should turn on a kind of T cell, or a B cell, to make an antibody. The problem with the illness that we have is that over 95% of the patients do not have antigen processing correctly, so that antibodies are made in a reduced fashion, if at all. And when we look at now, what control do we have on inflammation if the stimulus is not stopped? And it doesn't have to be ongoing exposure. It is now in this world of antigen interaction with antigen-presenting cells and T lymphocytes that has gone awry. And the illnesses that we see become chronic because antibody formation does not occur. Now, over the years, we knew about problems with antigen presentation, but now we know the gene mechanisms behind defective antigen presentation and the gene mechanisms to not only include inflammation in our venues, but also abnormalities in metabolism. So if we look at metabolic problems combined with inflammation, we have molecular hypometabolism, which is a fancy way of saying that 95% of patients with chronic fatigue have a specific abnormality in inflammation and metabolism that we can show with genetic makeup. And then with Scott's work and my work, we've been able to show that we can correct the gene activation when it's not supposed to be activated and correct gene suppression when it's not supposed to be suppressed. So what we're looking at is the transcriptomic or gene representative theory of illness causation and illness correction. Our last paper, and I hope you had a chance to take a look at it, but it's in your inbox if you didn't. The next question is now finally looking at, to me, the holy grail, and that's correction of dieback central nervous system degeneration. You may hear it called Alzheimer's. You may hear it called Parkinson's. You may hear that same called for atrophic myotrophic lateral sclerosis, or ALS. But we are there. We're there with gene activation and correction with our therapies that have been developed over the last 27 years.
Okay, so you're going after a host of immunological diseases, including extraordinarily widespread conditions like Alzheimer's. Dr. McMahon, do you want to explain to everybody what this has to do with where they live?
So there are a number of potential triggers that can cause the innate immune system to activate. And as Dr. Shoemaker pointed out, these people, or at least around 90% of them, don't have adequate or effective antibody production to help mitigate when there is chronic exposure. So the innate immune system is then basically left to handle this by itself without the antibody cavalry coming in and reducing the burden. And if you are living or working or going to school in a water damaged building where there is increased dampness or increased microbial growth from molds or bacteria or actinobacteria or all of the above, when you inhale those, your body recognizes those as being foreign antigens. And it's not just, for instance, say mold spores. It can be old, dead mold spores that have lost their integrity. Their cell wall is broken apart into hundreds of fragments. And in fact, those fragments, when you inhale them, go even deeper down your respiratory tract into your lung, and again, trigger the innate immune system. As a response to that, the innate immune system will overproduce cytokines in the same way that you would overproduce cytokines if you got the flu or if you got COVID or some other kind of viral infection. And these fragments trigger the innate immune system and the overproduction of the cytokines. And then the cytokines cause the symptoms that we commonly relate to with the flu, which could include headaches, muscle aches, joint pains, fatigue, malaise, difficulty sleeping, coughing, other respiratory issues, brain fog, etc., etc.
Okay, so let me get the whole sequence of this straight. So what you guys have been studying is sometimes just, and stop me, at any point if I get any of this wrong. Sometimes people refer to this as sick building syndrome. You've brought in conditions like Alzheimer's and other immunological diseases, chronic fatigue syndrome. I know you've concentrated to some degree too on fibromyalgia. So the idea is that there are many buildings, and we'll talk about how many, but there are many buildings that harbor airborne pathogens, mold being first and foremost among them, perhaps. That's much more likely in buildings that have been water damaged and not properly remediated. The consequence of that is that if people are in those buildings, living in them or working in them, that they're chronically exposed to pathogens that can trigger an immune response. And some people, when that immune response is triggered, they're not producing antibodies in a proper manner. And there are genetic reasons for that and possibly metabolic reasons as well. And then is it the combination of the pathogens that are in the local environment plus the genetic weakness or the metabolic problems that produce this cytokine storm that you associated with flu-like symptoms and pain and chronic inflammation? Now, and have I got all that right? Is that the way this lays itself out?
You're doing great. Keep on.
That was excellent.
Okay, good. So let's go through that one by one then. The first issue is then, what percentage of buildings in North America and elsewhere in the world do you think are suffering from this problem? And if it's a large number of buildings, that's obviously a catastrophe. So what's the evidence for this, and why did you guys become convinced of this?
What we have seen is a similarity of the syndrome of acute exposure followed by chronic exposure wherever the person might live. It's not confined to Florida or Hawaii. Could be in Nepal, or could be in Stuttgart. This worldwide exposure to an environment that pretty much is 62 to 78 degrees year round. No wind, no rain, no change of the seasons indoors. And the mark of every one of these indoor places is water intrusion. So if we look to see, is there a water damaged building, we should be able to find an ecosystem of organisms. Now, you mentioned fungi, and I've written books, Surviving Mold and Mold Warriors, out of the best evidence at the time, and that was wrong. We know that fungi have a role, but we also know that endotoxins from bacteria are second on the list, and first is actinobacteria. And when you look at every building that's water damaged that has these ecologic parameters, you find the same symptoms, the same laboratory findings, and now that we have access to gene evaluation, the same gene activation, and the likelihood that this would be due to something else becomes a statistical problem. In some of Scott's work, he's published that the likelihood is that you've got a p-value of p is less than 1 to the minus 50th power. So it could be the same in Stuttgart if the illness was the same, but actually statistically, the idea that it's not the same is so remote to be impossible.
Okay, so Scott, what proportion of modern buildings, first of all, is it modern buildings that are particularly affected? And if not, or if so, what proportion of buildings in general are we talking about? And are there specific kinds of buildings that appear more susceptible? I read in some of the work of yours that I reviewed, for example, that drywall seems to be a particular problem. So what kind of, how widespread is this problem, do you suppose? And what buildings are particularly affected?
Well, the EPA has published, the United States Environmental Protection Agency has published that at least 50% of the buildings and up to 85% of the buildings in the United States are historically water damaged.
Buildings that are involved are not due to one era of construction or another. With modern structures put up quickly, contractors investing money, he wants to turn over the house, sale quickly, so he may not wait for a master plumber to put in the bathroom, and a plumbing leak can develop. Construction defects for new homes are a real bugaboo. But even when we were in Scotland, in the castles from the 1200s and before, we saw the same kinds of problems. But in the older buildings where they had not been paints used with fungicides in them, for example, we didn't find the same organisms making toxins the way we do in the newer buildings. And about in 1970, when the population got all upset with the oil embargoes and houses were made to be tighter, we thought that that was the reason for the problem. It was actually not, because what we were using were paints and sealants to keep down mold growth. What we did was create natural selection to kill off molds that could be killed, and if with the molds that survived became toxin formers, where before they didn't. So before 1970, it usually was a building that was retrofitted or retrograde corrected, or modern construction. The safest buildings, even though they're water damaged, are the old buildings with no paint.
Okay, so there's no specific form of building that's amenable per se to water damage and the intrusion of toxins in consequence. But you talk about buildings after 1970. You said your first hypothesis was these buildings were arguably more dangerous because they were more airtight as a consequence of panic over declining fossil fuel availability. And I remember when people started talking about sick building syndrome, I guess this went back as far, in my knowledge, as far back as the 80s. They were concerned about these hyper-sealed buildings. But you said that your further investigations revealed that it wasn't the sealing of the buildings per se, so much as the use of modern paints and sealants that had antifungal chemicals embedded in them. Now, hypothetically, the reason they put those antifungals and anti-mold chemicals in the paints was to keep the fungus and mold down. But you said, or you're implying, I think you said directly, that the consequence of that, the unintended consequence of that, was that we produced molds and other toxins that were more toxic rather than less as a consequence of natural selection. So why did natural selection, which was obviously selecting molds and other biohazards that could tolerate the exposure to this poison, why did they become more toxic? And what's your evidence for that?
Fungi also have a response to environmental hazards, and the environmental hazards of being killed will cause normal activation of genes in fungal species such that they'll make toxins where beforehand they didn't. Well, the main role of a mycotoxin, for example, has nothing to do with defense. It has everything to do with predation. So the fungus wants to be eating a plant, and the plant doesn't want to be eaten, so it'll release things like a peroxidase, and the fungi make compounds to eliminate the fungi. They eliminate the peroxidase, therefore eliminate the plant defenses. But it's predation of fungi on its prey that's foremost where all this goes on. Meanwhile, actinobacteria love an alkaline environment. Molds like an acid environment, and the alkaline environment from actino is created by manufacture of substances that will kill off fungi and change the pH of the drywall. So that as you see an initial building, the initial colonization will be with fungi, but it'll be replaced by actinobacteria as time goes on. But meanwhile, if there's a flood or a hurricane event or a natural disaster, the water saturation, or AW, as the people should say, activity of water, will initially let in organisms that like very saturated conditions, or AW of 0.9 to its maximum of 1.0 or 100%. So we see one group of fungi of water damage that's acute, or different species will be grouping of water damage that's less acute, and in the end, then we'll see sources that have very dry buildings, but where the moisture has changed the ecosystem. Now, actinobacteria are famous for creating smell. And interestingly, the musty smell or musty odor that we've long associated with fungal colonization is coming from actinos.
Geosmin. There are also architectural design features that make a building more likely to become water damaged than others. Flat roofs are more likely to leak than pitched roofs are. Basements and crawl spaces are more likely to have water intrusions than you would see in homes that are built on a slab. We know that drywall is more likely to have problems than plaster on lath. And so there are a number of different materials and architectural styles that can make a house or a commercial building more vulnerable or less vulnerable.
Right. Well, you could imagine, when I'm thinking my paranoid thoughts, I know here's an example. So one of the reasons that the Roman Empire fell was because the Romans used lead to seal their wine amphora. And lead is a known neurotoxin. And when we introduced lead into gasoline to stop the gas from our internal combustion engines from knocking, we lowered the IQ of people around the world by a substantial margin. It was really quite a catastrophe. And it was also the case that in relatively low, let's see, in older houses that had used a plethora of lead paint, where the paint was allowed to deteriorate, and young children were therefore ingesting lead paint powder, they were also impaired in terms of their intelligence and also much more likely to be antisocial and criminal. And so the reason I'm bringing this up is because it's possible for a society to introduce something into their midst that's then distributed in an extraordinarily widespread fashion. Experimental vaccines come to mind, by the way, and all of a sudden, all sorts of things that weren't understood about that thing that's being introduced make themselves manifest. And it sounds like that's a case that you're making for drywall, is that it's an extraordinarily light, easy to work with, cheap building substance, but it isn't. We don't have a lot of historical experience with it. It was introduced in a very widespread manner in the latter half of the 20th century. And then you're saying that in combination with the fungicides and so forth that was put in the paint, that we put ourselves in a situation where we've contaminated something approximating 50 to 80% of buildings. So that's really quite the bloody catastrophe. So now let's take that apart a little bit. If it's 50 to 80% of buildings, how many of them, in your estimation, are contaminated to the point where that actually constitutes a serious health problem? Like, I know that that's a threshold issue, but there's lots of threats that people have to contend with, obviously. And if your house is contaminated with mold and water damage, that's a big deal. It's a really difficult thing to fix, or it can be. And so, under what conditions should should people be prioritizing this as a actionable risk factor? And how widespread do you think this problem is in its more serious forms?
Study after study has looked at individual susceptibility, which underlies who gets sick and who doesn't. The individual susceptibility of the immune response genes found in chromosome 6, or HLA-DR, was shown to be present in just about every person who had CIRS, and the percentage of not having CIRS HLA but having an illness is less than 5% of the total. So 95% were broken out into 6 separate haplotypes. There are 54 available. And out of those 6, it's 24% of the population. When we look at this 24%, if we put them into exposure and follow them prospectively, we can show that the initial responses, once a priming event has taken place, is essentially 100% in those with individual susceptibility. We're seeing this exactly the same way with COVID. COVID creates an inflammatory response. It turns on innate immune responses, which turns on gene-based susceptibility. So long COVID has the same genetic makeup, and we've published a paper on this in June of last year as well, that it creates a new illness, a new target where once wasn't before. And we looked at people who were living in a building and fine, got COVID, got better from COVID, but then that turned on the innate immune response system that didn't stop. And lo and behold, a month later, 2 months later, 3 months later, they had long COVID syndrome, when actually what they had was a chronic inflammatory and metabolic response syndrome. It was just a different initiator. It could be a horde of yellow jackets stinging people at a picnic, creating an inflammatory response, or it could be an illness. In this case, COVID fills the bill.
You know how everyone tells you to lock your doors when you leave home? Well, going online without protection is exactly like leaving your house unlocked, except the stakes are even higher. Sure, you might trust some of your neighbors, but what about the thousands of strangers who can access your personal data every time you connect to public Wi-Fi? Here's something that might keep you up at night. Hackers don't need fancy equipment to steal your information. With just some basic hardware, even a tech-savvy kid could potentially access your passwords, banking details, and personal data when you're using public Wi-Fi. And once they have it, your information could be sold on the dark web for up to $1,000 a pop. That's why we here at The Daily Wire are proud to partner with ExpressVPN. Both our hosts and production teams rest easy amidst their busy travel schedules, knowing their data isn't being compromised regardless of where they're using the internet. The best part is ExpressVPN's encryption is so powerful that it would take a hacker with a supercomputer over 1 billion years to crack it. Plus, it works across all your devices with just one click, making it simple and easy to use. Find out how you can get 4 months free by scanning the QR code on screen, clicking the link in the description box below, or going to expressvpn.com/JordanYT.
Okay. So you could imagine that there's a manner of conceptualization that allows for 2 kinds of disease processes. There's disease processes that are associated with pathogens per se, and then there are disease processes associated with an anti-disease response or an immunological response gone astray. So if I'm following you correctly, we have a situation where, let's say, 75% of our buildings are contaminated. And so 3/4 of the population is exposed to the pathogens that could produce an immune hyperresponse. But 25% of the population in those buildings is particularly susceptible to that because they have a genetic predisposition to immune overreaction in response to the specific kinds of pathogens we're describing? Or is that a more general susceptibility to immune overreaction? You seem to be implying that in relationship to the COVID issue. So it's 25% of 75%, essentially, is the number of people who are hypothetically affected. So that's about 25%. That's about 20% of people, all things considered, might be experiencing this as a serious problem. So have I got that? Have I got all that right?
Yes, you do, and you picked it up very quickly. I thank you for that. One of the reasons that it's so important is that we look at illnesses that are CIRS, that actually are CIRS, and add up who has chronic fatigue syndrome, who has fibromyalgia, who has depression, who's just getting older because their cognitive function is going forward. Or children not doing well in school. Is it the lead paint that they swallowed? Is it the lead in the applesauce that they've been taking in? are the environmental factors that are creating this overall systemic illness, of which the brain is the injury I worry most about in adults. Scott sees children more than I did, so we can let him speak about children's with cognitive issues. But the issues are that when we look carefully at chronic fatigue syndrome, we find CIRS. And I'd like you, sir, if you could, to identify one significant biomarker that distinguishes fibromyalgia from not. We have 30 biomarkers for CIRS and 0 for fibromyalgia. Why does fibromyalgia have such a preponderance of people? And how many people, adults, have fibromyalgia? 10%? Add 3% for chronic fatigue syndrome. How about post-Lyme syndrome? How about depression? Boy, we've got 25% all of a sudden. And we must start looking at those details. We can stratify sick versus non-sick, cases versus controls, treat them, and show that cases equal to controls, and they become controls after treatment has occurred.
Okay, so one of the things that the non-medical listeners and watchers of this podcast might not know is that there's a lot of overlap in symptoms between hypothetically different illnesses. And so let's take depression as a case in point. Now, when I was assessing my clients for depression, the first thing I always tried to figure out was, are they just ill? Because there's all sorts of evidence associating depression, particularly with immunological dysfunction. And so I would inquire into their sleep habits and their eating habits and also their associated health conditions to find out if we could, because my sense was before we diagnosed something as psychological, we should take a look and see if there's actually something causing it. And depression is a relatively non-specific cluster of syndromes. Now, you're pointing to a whole set of syndromes that have relatively non-specific symptoms, some of them even more difficult to diagnose and easier to be skeptical about in relationship even to their existence, as, say, fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue syndrome, right? That's hard to dissociate from general depression and anxiety and a kind of global neuroticism or even a hypochondriasis. Now, you're saying, your first claim is that 20% of the population is likely to be experiencing these symptoms, but we don't see we don't see this CIRS, chronic inflammatory response syndrome, in 20% of people because essentially we're placing them in the wrong bins.